The fire inside the rock cavern burned steady and warm, while outside the wind screamed at 40 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Owen Harlan stood at the carved entrance watching the Fletchers sleep near the glowing hearth, their child wrapped in blankets, alive because he had spent 8 months chiseling a home into solid mountain stone that everyone said was impossible. If you've ever wondered how people survived the worst winters before modern heating, hit that subscribe button, because this story reveals a technique that saved lives during the deadliest blizzard in Appalachian history. The winter of 1883 arrived early in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and refused to loosen its grip. By late November, frost covered the ground each morning and stayed until midday. By December, it never melted at all. Owen Harlan woke each morning in the cabin he shared with Isaac Monroe to find ice crystals coating the interior walls near the ceiling where their breath had frozen during the night. The fire in their stone hearth burned constantly, consuming wood at a rate that concerned both men. They had built the cabin 3 years earlier, following techniques Owen's father had taught him in Virginia. Logs notched at corners, chinked with clay and moss, a solid door, one window covered with oiled paper, and a fieldstone fireplace that drew smoke efficiently. The structure was typical of Appalachian mountain cabins, designed to provide shelter from rain and moderate cold. But this winter tested limits neither man had experienced before. Owen spent his days cutting firewood. He would leave at first light, work until his hands lost feeling despite heavy gloves, return to warm himself by the fire, then head back out for another load. Isaac, older by 15 years and less suited to the physical labor, maintained the fire and processed their small trap line. They were hunters primarily, selling pelts and dried meat to settlements in the valleys below. The isolation suited them both. Owen was 28 years old and had come to the mountains to escape the crowded settlements of the Piedmont. Isaac had lived in these hills for 2 decades, preferring solitude to society. The cold became the dominant fact of their existence. Every action revolved around maintaining warmth. They ate meals close to the fire. They slept in layers of blankets and furs on platforms raised above the dirt floor. They stuffed rags around the doorframe and window edges to block drafts. Despite these efforts, the cabin remained barely tolerable. The fire heated a radius of perhaps 8 feet effectively. Beyond that, the temperature dropped rapidly. The corners of the cabin stayed perpetually cold. Frost formed on the interior walls each night. Owen began noticing details that troubled him. The chinking between logs contracted in the extreme cold, creating hairline gaps that admitted frigid air. The door, solid as it appeared, allowed wind to penetrate around its edges. The stone fireplace, well built and efficient, still lost most of its heat up the chimney. Heat rose naturally, and their design captured only a fraction before it escaped. The cabin consumed enormous amounts of wood to maintain minimal comfort. Isaac accepted these conditions as simply the cost of mountain winter. He had survived previous hard winters and expected to survive this one. Owen found himself unable to accept that explanation. Something about the inefficiency bothered him deeply. They were working constantly just to stay marginally warm. There had to be a better approach. On the night of January 9, 1884, the temperature fell to levels neither man had experienced. Owen woke sometime after midnight to darkness and bitter cold. The fire had died to embers. He could see his breath in thick clouds, illuminated by faint moonlight through the window. He sat up, disoriented, and realized Isaac had been responsible for maintaining the fire through the night. Owen called his partner's name. No response came from the sleeping platform across the cabin. Owen forced himself from beneath his blankets and moved to the fireplace. His hands shook violently as he added kindling to the embers and blew carefully until flames caught. The fire grew slowly, pushing back the darkness. With light restored, Owen turned to check on Isaac and found his partner motionless on the sleeping platform, covered in frost. Isaac Monroe was dead. The cold had killed him while he slept. Owen would later piece together what happened. Isaac had maintained the fire until late in the night, but had fallen asleep before adding enough wood to last until dawn. The fire consumed its fuel and died. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly once the heat source failed. Isaac, exhausted from days of inadequate sleep and constant cold stress, never woke. The cold simply stopped his heart. Owen sat beside Isaac's body. As dawn broke, unable to process what had occurred, they had survived grisly encounters, harsh summers, scarce game, and countless challenges. Death by cold inside their own cabin seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The shelter they had trusted had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He spent that day preparing Isaac's body and the next 2 days digging a grave on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped beaver for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. Owen had to build fires on the gravesite to thaw the earth before he could dig. He marked the grave with stacked stones and stood in the cold wind trying to find words that seemed adequate. None came. He returned to the cabin alone. The structure felt different now. Owen saw it clearly for the first time as what it truly was. A temporary barrier against the elements that worked adequately in moderate conditions but failed catastrophically when tested by genuine cold. The walls were too thin, the gaps too numerous, the heating method too inefficient. Every cabin in these mountains shared the same fundamental weaknesses. Men simply accepted the risk and hoped they would survive each winter. Owen could not accept that anymore. Isaac's death had revealed something he could not ignore. The traditional approach to mountain shelter was inadequate. Cabins fought the cold through constant fuel consumption and still lost the battle when temperatures became extreme. There had to be another way. A method that did not rely on burning endless wood just to maintain marginal warmth. A shelter that worked with natural principles instead of fighting them constantly. That night, Owen lay awake in the cabin, listening to wind push through gaps in the chinking. His mind turned obsessively to a single question. How do you build a shelter that stays warm without constant fire? Owen spent the following weeks completing the winter's work alone. He checked trap lines, processed pelts, and maintained adequate firewood supply. But his mind remained fixed on the problem of shelter and heat. He began studying his cabin with new attention, identifying every point where warmth escaped. The gaps between logs, the door frame, the window, the chimney that pulled heated air upward and expelled it into the sky. The entire structure was designed to leak. He visited neighboring cabins under the pretense of trading supplies and checking on families during the harsh winter. Each structure revealed the same patterns. Caleb Drummond's cabin 3 miles south had better chinking than Owen's, but suffered worse drafts around the door. The Hastings family 5 miles east had built their cabin into a hillside for wind protection, but still burned wood constantly to maintain barely adequate warmth. Everyone accepted these conditions as unchangeable reality. Owen asked questions that others found strange. How much wood did they burn per day? How cold did their cabins get overnight? Had they noticed temperature differences between areas near walls versus the cabin center? Most people answered politely, but clearly thought grief had affected his thinking. Caleb told him directly that mountain winters were simply hard, and no amount of clever building would change that fundamental truth. But Owen had begun noticing something others overlooked. Natural caves maintained steady temperatures regardless of outside conditions. He had sheltered in shallow rock overhangs during hunting trips and noticed they felt warmer than the open air even without fires. One particular cave he remembered clearly, a deep crack in a limestone cliff where he had waited out a thunderstorm the previous summer. Inside, 15 feet from the entrance, the air had been noticeably cool despite summer heat outside. In late February, Owen hiked to that cave specifically to test his theory. The journey took most of a day through snow that remained knee-deep in shaded areas. He found the cave entrance, partially blocked by ice but still accessible. He crawled inside and moved back into the darkness until daylight became a distant glow behind him. The temperature change was immediate and dramatic. Outside, the air was bitter cold with wind that cut through his heavy coat. Inside the cave, 30 feet from the entrance, the air was still and noticeably warmer. Not warm in any absolute sense, but significantly less cold than the surface. Owen sat in that darkness for an hour, thinking. The rock around him held temperature that outside air did not. Stone had mass and substance that wood lacked. It absorbed and retained heat or cold from deeper in the earth where temperatures remained constant. A cave stayed cool in summer and warm in winter relative to surface conditions because it was connected to that deep, stable temperature. The question formed clearly for the first time. What if you did not build on top of the ground, but instead went into it? Not a cave exactly, but something carved, deliberately. A shelter made from stone instead of wood. A space that used the Earth's own temperature instead of fighting it. Owen returned to his cabin with a plan that he knew would sound insane to anyone he told. He would carve a living space directly into solid rock. Not a shallow cave or dugout shelter, but a proper room excavated from mountain stone. The idea violated everything mountain people understood about building. Cabins could be constructed in days. Carving rock would take months. Wood was abundant and easy to work. Stone required tools that broke and effort that exhausted. No one carved homes from solid cliff faces because the work seemed impossible. But Owen could not abandon the logic. Rock held temperature. Rock blocked wind completely. Rock required no chinking, no maintenance, no constant adjustment. A space carved into stone would be thermally connected to the stable temperature deep in the mountain. Fire heat would be absorbed by rock walls and radiated back, instead of lost through gaps and chimneys. The more he considered it, the more certain he became. He spent 2 weeks in early March scouting locations. He needed a cliff face with the right characteristics. South-facing for sun exposure at the entrance. Solid stone without major cracks or fracture lines that would make carving dangerous. Located near water, but above flood potential. High enough to avoid valley cold air, but accessible enough to haul supplies. He found the site on a ridge overlooking a creek tributary. A limestone cliff approximately 40 feet high with a vertical face that appeared solid and uniform. Owen began work on March 20, 1884. His tools were simple. A heavy hammer, 3 iron chisels of different sizes, a pry bar, and determination born from watching his partner freeze to death. He started at eye level, chipping away at the stone face to create a horizontal cut. Limestone was softer than granite, but still required tremendous effort. Each hammer blow sent vibrations through his arms. Progress was measured in inches per day. Caleb Drummond visited in early April and found Owen covered in stone dust, hammering at the cliff face. Caleb watched for several minutes before speaking. He asked what Owen was doing. Owen explained he was carving a shelter into the rock. Caleb stared at him, then asked how long Owen thought that would take. Owen admitted he did not know exactly. Months, certainly. Caleb shook his head and said a man could build 3 cabins in the time it would take to carve a room from solid stone. Owen agreed that was probably true. Caleb asked why anyone would waste effort on such foolishness. Owen said because rock does not burn wood to stay warm. Caleb left, convinced that grief and isolation had damaged Owen's mind. Word spread through the scattered mountain community. Owen Harlan was carving a cave like some kind of animal, wasting his time on stone when perfectly good trees surrounded him. People began. Avoiding his ridge, not wanting to witness the embarrassing spectacle of a man engaged in pointless labor. Owen continued working, indifferent to their opinions. The work consumed Owen completely. He developed a rhythm that governed his days from April through November of 1884. Wake before dawn, eat a cold breakfast of cornmeal and dried meat, work the stone until his hands could no longer grip the tools, rest briefly, then return to hammering until darkness made precision impossible. His body adapted to demands he had never placed on it before. His hands developed calluses over calluses. His shoulders and back grew stronger from the constant overhead hammering required to carve the ceiling sections. The technique evolved through necessity and observation. Owen learned that limestone fractured along natural planes if he could identify them. Hours spent studying the rock face revealed subtle lines where ancient sediment layers had compressed differently. He could place his chisel on these lines and split away larger sections with less effort than trying to pulverize solid stone. But finding these planes required patience and attention that tested him constantly. He carved the entrance first, creating an opening 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The dimensions were deliberate, wide enough to move supplies through, but narrow enough to minimize heat loss. Tall enough to enter upright, but low enough that the opening represented a small percentage of the eventual interior volume. He angled the entrance slightly downward, carving into the cliff at a 5-degree decline. This created a natural cold air trap. Heavy cold air would sink and flow out, while warm air would rise and remain trapped deeper in the carved space. The interior chamber took shape slowly through summer and into fall. Owen carved a room 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the center. The dimensions were limited by his ability to remove broken stone. Everything he chiseled free had to be carried out through the entrance. Larger rooms would require moving proportionally more material. He settled on a size that would provide adequate living space while remaining achievable for one man working alone. The debris removal became its own challenge. Owen estimated he moved approximately 8 tons of broken limestone during the excavation. He carried it out in a canvas sack, dumping each load down the hillside below the cliff. The pile of rubble grew into a significant mound that marked his progress visibly. Neighbors who saw it from a distance used it to track how much stone Owen had removed, shaking their heads at the wasted effort. Tool maintenance consumed significant time. Chisels dulled quickly against stone. Owen had to reheat and reshape the cutting edges every few days using a small forge he built near the worksite. He learned to recognize when a chisel was about to break and retire it before the metal shattered and wasted the entire tool. He broke 11 chisels during the excavation and wore out 2 hammer handles from constant use. By September, the basic chamber was complete. Owen stood inside the carved space, 40 feet into solid mountain stone, and felt the temperature difference immediately. Outside, autumn air was cool. Inside, the rock held summer warmth. The carved chamber was complete, but not yet habitable. Owen faced the critical problem that had ended many attempts at underground shelter throughout history. Smoke? A fire inside the sealed rock room would quickly fill the space with choking fumes and make breathing impossible. Traditional caves either had natural chimneys created by vertical cracks in the stone, or they remained unusable for long-term habitation. Owen needed to create ventilation that allowed smoke to escape while preventing heat from following it out. He studied the rock ceiling for 2 weeks before beginning the ventilation work. The limestone above his carved chamber varied in thickness. In some areas, the stone extended 20 feet to the surface. In others, particularly near the back of the chamber, the distance was closer to 12 feet. Owen selected 3 locations where the stone was thinnest and began carving vertical channels upward. The work was brutally difficult. He had to chisel upward against gravity, standing on a platform he built from logs, reaching overhead to hammer at stone he could barely see in the dim light. Stone chips fell constantly into his face and eyes. Progress slowed to inches per week. Each ventilation channel was 6 inches in diameter, wide enough to draw smoke, but narrow enough to create natural draft without pulling excessive heat. The first channel broke through to the surface after 5 weeks of upward carving. Owen was inside the chamber when suddenly daylight appeared as a small, bright spot in the ceiling. Fresh air flowed down immediately, drawn by the temperature difference between the warm interior and cool exterior. He had successfully connected his carved space to the outside world through a controlled opening. He completed the second and third ventilation channels over the following month. The 3 openings created a circulation pattern that proved remarkably effective. Smoke from a fire would rise naturally, drawn toward the ceiling, and exit through whichever channel provided the easiest path based on wind direction outside. Fresh air entered through the entrance, creating a slow, continuous flow that prevented smoke accumulation while maintaining the warm air mass in the lower portions of the chamber. Owen built his hearth with equal care. Most cabins placed fires in corners or against walls. Owen positioned his fire ring in the center of the chamber, 8 feet from the entrance. The location was strategic. Heat would radiate outward in all directions, warming the rock walls, floor, and ceiling uniformly. The rock itself would absorb that heat and hold it long after the fire diminished. He constructed the hearth from flat stones arranged in a circle 2 feet in diameter. No mortar or clay, just carefully selected rocks that fit together tightly. He surrounded the fire ring with a raised stone lip that would contain coals and prevent them from spreading across the floor. Above the hearth, smoke would rise naturally toward the ventilation channels in the ceiling. Owen lit the first fire inside his carved chamber on October 12, 1884. The smoke drew upward cleanly and exited through the ventilation channels as designed. Owen moved into the carved cavern in late October as the first serious cold of autumn settled over the mountains. He brought minimal supplies: a sleeping platform constructed from split planks, blankets and furs from his trap lines, cooking equipment, dried food stores, and his remaining tools. The entrance remained open, protected only by a canvas tarp he could drop for privacy or weather protection. He had not yet built a proper door, wanting first to test whether the carved space functioned as he believed it would. The first night revealed the fundamental difference between his stone shelter and any wooden cabin. Owen built a modest fire in the center hearth as temperatures outside dropped toward freezing. He kept the fire burning for approximately 3 hours while he prepared his sleeping area and organized supplies. Then he let the flames die to coals and eventually go out completely. He wanted to see what happened when the heat source stopped. In a cabin, the temperature would drop rapidly once the fire died. Within an hour, the interior would match the exterior cold. Owen lay on his sleeping platform wrapped in a single blanket and waited. An hour passed. The air remained comfortable. 2 hours. Still warm enough that he did not need additional covering. 3 hours after the fire had gone completely cold, the chamber retained enough heat that Owen slept through the night without discomfort. He woke before dawn and immediately noticed the temperature. The air was cool, but not cold. His breath did not form clouds as it would inside a cabin. The rock walls, when he placed his hand against them, felt warm to the touch. They had absorbed heat from the fire and were now radiating it back into the space. The thermal mass he had theorized about was functioning exactly as he hoped. Over the following weeks, Owen refined his understanding of the system. A fire burned for 2 hours in the evening would keep the chamber comfortable through the entire night and into the next morning. The rock continued radiating stored heat for 10 to 12 hours after the flames died. This meant Owen needed perhaps 1/5 the firewood that a cabin required. The efficiency was remarkable and undeniable. The ventilation channels worked better than expected. Smoke exited cleanly without creating drafts that pulled heat away. The narrow diameter of each channel created enough restriction that air moved slowly, carrying smoke out, but not creating the rapid convection that made cabin chimneys waste heat. Cold air entering through the entrance remained low, sinking to the floor near the opening, while warm air stayed suspended in the upper portions of the chamber and the back areas farthest from outside exposure. By mid-November, Owen had proven his concept completely. The carved stone shelter maintained comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. The rock walls eliminated all drafts and wind penetration. The system worked not by fighting the cold, but by using the mountain's own thermal mass as a storage battery for fire heat. He began planning the final improvements that would make the space secure and weatherproof before winter arrived in full force. Owen completed his door in early December. He had learned from cabin failures and designed something that would seal completely. Heavy planks cut from oak and fitted together with iron brackets he had traded for in the nearest settlement. The door hung on iron hinges mortised directly into the rock entrance frame. He had carved recesses for the hinges while excavating, planning for this moment months in advance. A wooden beam slid across the interior into brackets, locking the door against the stone itself. When sealed, no gap existed where wind could penetrate. Winter arrived with normal cold through December. Owen lived comfortably in his carved shelter, burning small fires each evening and watching the rock walls store and release heat with predictable efficiency. He ventured out to check trap lines and hunt when weather permitted. The pile of firewood he had prepared was barely diminished. In a cabin, he would have consumed 3 times the amount by this point in winter. Caleb Drummond visited in late December and accepted Owen's invitation to see the interior. Caleb had continued to mock the project publicly, but curiosity had apparently overcome his skepticism. He entered the carved chamber and stood, silently, looking at the rock walls, the central hearth, the sleeping platform, and the supplies organized on stone shelves Owen had carved into the walls. The temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside, despite only a small fire burning. Caleb asked how much wood Owen burned daily. Owen told him 2 hours of fire each evening. Caleb nodded slowly and left without further comment. January of 1885 began cold but nothing unusual for the mountains. Then, on January 8th, the sky changed. Owen noticed it at dawn. The color was wrong. Not blue or gray, but a peculiar white that extended from horizon to horizon. The air was utterly still. No wind, no sound, just oppressive silence and that strange white sky. By midday, the temperature had dropped noticeably. By evening, snow began falling. Not the usual mountain snow that came in flurries, but thick, heavy flakes that fell straight down in the windless air. Owen sealed his door and built up his evening fire, watching through a small gap as snow accumulated outside. It fell continuously through the night. By dawn, 3 feet covered the ground. The snow continued. For 2 days, snow fell without pause. The accumulation outside Owen's entrance reached 5 feet, then 6. He had to dig a path just to reach his woodpile, which he had positioned near the entrance under a rock overhang. The temperature continued dropping. Owen had no thermometer, but he recognized cold that went beyond anything he had previously experienced. On the 3rd day, the wind arrived. It came from the north with a sound like continuous thunder. The wind drove the fallen snow horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to arm's length. The temperature plummeted further. Owen sat inside his carved chamber, listening to the wind scream outside. The sound was muted by 40 feet of solid rock, but still audible as a distant roar. Inside, the temperature remained comfortable. He had burned a fire for 3 hours the previous evening, and the rock walls continued radiating stored heat. He estimated the interior temperature at roughly 60 degrees, while outside the wind chill had dropped to levels that would kill an exposed person in minutes. On the 4th day of the blizzard, Owen heard something unusual over the wind noise. Voices. Shouting. He opened his door and found himself facing a wall of snow that had drifted against the entrance. He dug through it and emerged into white chaos. 3 figures struggled through the storm toward his cliff face. Robert Fletcher, his wife Sarah, and their daughter, who appeared to be perhaps 6 years old. All 3 were covered in snow and ice, moving with the slow confusion of people near the end of their strength. Owen grabbed Robert's arm and pulled him toward the entrance. Sarah followed, carrying their child. Owen got them through the door and sealed it behind them. Inside, the sudden absence of wind and the relative warmth caused visible shock. Sarah collapsed to her knees, still holding her daughter. Robert stood swaying, unable to speak coherently. Owen moved them near the fire ring and built up the flames. He wrapped blankets around all 3 and heated water for them to drink. Slowly, they recovered enough to explain. They had been traveling to visit Sarah's family in a settlement 2 valleys over when the storm caught them. Their horse had died in the cold. They had abandoned their supplies and tried to reach any shelter. Robert remembered Owen's ridge from a previous trip and had aimed for it desperately, knowing it was their only chance. The child, whose name was Emma, had stopped shivering. Her lips were blue and her responses slow. Owen recognized the signs of dangerous cold exposure. He placed her closest to the fire and wrapped her in every fur he possessed. Sarah held her daughter and wept quietly. Robert sat with his head in his hands, too exhausted to do more than breathe. Over the next hours, warmth from the rock walls and fire gradually brought all 3 back to full consciousness. Emma's color returned. Sarah stopped shaking. Robert finally spoke clearly, asking Owen how his shelter remained so warm. Owen explained the carved chamber and the thermal mass principle. Robert listened and shook his head slowly, saying he had heard people mock Owen for wasting time on such foolishness. The blizzard continued for 3 more days. Owen shared his food supplies and maintained the fire on a regular schedule. The Fletchers slept on his platform while he made do with blankets on the stone floor. The chamber that had been designed for 1 person held 4 without difficulty. The rock continued absorbing and radiating heat with the same steady efficiency. On the 6th day, the wind finally stopped. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the immediate danger had passed. The snow lay 8 feet deep in drifts when Owen and Robert dug a path from the entrance on the 7th day after the storm began. The landscape had transformed into something unrecognizable. Trees were buried to their upper branches. The creek had frozen solid. Everything was white and still under a sky that had finally cleared to blue. The cold remained intense enough that exposed skin froze in minutes. Robert left first to check on his family's original destination and assess the damage throughout the region. He returned 2 days later with news that confirmed what Owen had suspected. The blizzard had killed people. Caleb Drummond had survived, but his cabin had become so cold that ice formed on the interior walls. The Hastings family had burned their furniture to keep their fire going and had still barely maintained survivable temperatures. An elderly trapper named Warren had frozen to death in his cabin when his wood supply ran out. Robert told everyone he encountered about Owen's carved shelter and how it had saved his family. The story spread quickly through the scattered mountain communities. The man they had mocked for wasting 8 months, carving stone, had created the only truly warm shelter within a day's travel. His innovation had proven superior in exactly the crisis that revealed all traditional methods as inadequate. Caleb Drummond arrived at Owens Ridge in late January. He did not apologize for his previous mockery, but he asked detailed questions. How deep had Owen carved? What tools had he used? How did the ventilation system work? Owen answered everything fully and offered to show Caleb the interior again. Caleb spent an hour examining the carved chamber, touching the rock walls, studying the hearth placement, and asking about thermal mass and heat retention. Over the following months, other mountaineers began attempting similar excavations. Some succeeded in creating smaller versions of Owen's design. Others lacked the patience or encountered stone that was too hard to carve with available tools. But the principle had been demonstrated, and people recognized its value. Owen helped several families select appropriate cliff faces and advised them on excavation techniques. He shared what he had learned about finding natural fracture planes in limestone and the optimal dimensions for ventilation channels. He asked nothing in return. Sarah Fletcher visited in spring with Emma, bringing Owen a quilt she had sewn as thanks for saving their lives. The girl had recovered completely and spent an hour exploring the carved chamber with obvious fascination. She asked Owen if he had been scared while carving into the mountain alone. Owen considered the question seriously before answering that he had been more scared of freezing like Isaac had. Owen Harlan died in 1907 at the age of 52. He was found in his carved chamber, seated near the cold hearth, having passed peacefully in his sleep. The interior remained exactly as he had maintained it for over 2 decades, clean, organized, and still warmer than the outside air despite no fire, burning for days. The rock had held its temperature even after Owen's death. The carved chamber stood for decades after, as silent proof that working with the mountain instead of on top of it had been the answer all along.